Up until now, we've been looking more at the straightforward inverted pyramid style of news, but there are other ways to tell news stories, and now we're going to start to look at them in the form of features. So the different types of stories that we primarily look at are hard news, which is really the current events, news incidents, this really straightforward summary lead inverted pyramid style. But sometimes we want to get a little more fluffy with our news. And so in this case, we're looking at soft news, more featurey news that may not be as time sensitive or just really takes a different angle. It's still needs a news hook, but it has more of a personal feel to it, more descriptive, uses a lot more anecdotes. So let's look at the kind of stories that we have. Hard news, news is going to tell you. So an example would be the death of a nationally known fashion designer. And the purpose really is to inform. But feature stories are going to show you, they're going to illustrate. So in this case, a feature story would be the impact of that nationally known fashion designer on the industry before their death. Or a story about a local designer's line of fall fashion. That would be an example of a feature story. So the purpose is we hook with an entertaining lead and then we inform them. So a feature involves the reader, it teaches the reader, it entertains the reader. Human interest is a big part of features. A lot of quotes, a lot of anecdotes, so little stories within the story. And a lot of times we go behind the news with these kind of feature stories. So the differences, let's look at the similarities first. They require a central theme, so we still have to have a who, what, why, when, where, and how. That paragraph's just in a different place now. They summarize the main point of the story. But the difference is we're going to go beyond those relevant facts only. We're going to delve deeper into this story. We're going to get more descriptions. A lot of times these feature stories will be longer. People are more committed to reading them, and so they have to sustain the reader's interest throughout. Here's some of the types of stories that you've probably seen and you just maybe not have realized they were features. So profiles, a human interest story, something that looks at a trend or a reaction, a flashback, a how-to story, some sort of consumer guide, or even a personal narrative. It's important to remember every single person has a story to tell. We just have to find the news hook that would enable us to tell that story from a journalistic sense. So we're looking at innovations, trends, issues, processes, but if we're going to do those stories, we have to be involved with the people who are engaged in them. That's what brings these kind of stories to life. Now, we've talked about the inverted pyramid, and we all know what that looks like, but this is how we write these feature stories. So this is what we call the writing hourglass, and you'll notice we have a lead now, and this lead takes you to a nut graph. The nut graph is the who, what, why, when, where, and how that we've seen in the summary lead before. But now we're going to see it a little bit further in the story. There's going to be a little bit of a narrative story on top of it before we get to it. Then we have the body, and you'll notice how big the conclusion is here compared to the inverted pyramid. We're not looking to get out of this story quickly. We're not looking for people not to read to the end. We want people to read to the end, so we want to give them something to read when they get there. So this is really the formula that we follow. This anecdotal lead, which is a narrative story of some sort. It can be a description, and I'll show you some examples of that. The nut graph. Then we transition to the body. The body's going to give us the information that we need to know in more of a linear historical format. Then we're going to transition. We're going to get to the conclusion. The conclusion is really going to make us feel like we finished the story. So the lead has to relate in some way to the nut graph. It has to relate to the facts. So it's going to be a story that takes us to those facts. We have to get to the nut graph fairly quickly. So it can't be a really lengthy story per se, but we want to have very specific examples in order to take us to this more general idea of what the nut graph will show. And we'll see an example of that. The nut graph is what we would call the so what factor. What is it you want the reader to know? It's only one paragraph. It shouldn't be any more. It should really be one sentence in a news story like this. But you have to be able to complete the sentence. My article is about, and specifically what's it about. That'll help you get to the nut graph. Your body is more historical. It's going to start from the beginning of your theme. Where does the story begin? And it's going to go through the entire story to the end. We're going to develop that using quotes and facts and statistics and getting anecdotes from the people that we interview. And then conclusion brings the story home, but it's important that it doesn't sum it up. This isn't a 5-paragraph essay. A lot of times this is going to come back to the lead in some way. A quote is a very effective way of kind of bringing your story home. So let's look. Here's an example of an anecdotal lead and a nut graph. And you can read this here about Douglas Whaley, stopped to buy clothes and canceled family trips. His friend began planning a wake for the 66-year-old retired Ohio State University law professor, and etc. And then you can see down here, this is taking us to this nut graph. More than 3,200 Americans are waiting for heart transplant, according to the United Network for Organ Sharing, and nearly 250 Americans died waiting last year. That's what the story's about, but we're using Douglas Whaley's story to take us there. Another example here about bath salts, and you can see this as an example. Neil Brown got high on so-called bath salts. He took his skinning knife and slit his face and stomach repeatedly. Now that's bringing this story really to life for you, and then we get the nut graph. From the deep south to California, first responders are being called to deal with exposure to stimulants, the powders often contain, etc. So this tells you what the story is about. And then finally, one that's a little bit closer to home here. The professor walks into the classroom, takes his position, stares up at the digital clock. He waits for the LED screen. 2 minutes earlier than the class is scheduled to begin. He begins to call roll. And you're like, well, this is just like any class until we get to the nut graph, what the story is about. This lesson in punctuality and time management applies to the classroom, and it turns out the professor was Jim Tressel. So you can see that's what the story will be about Jim Tressel's class, but this anecdotal lead takes us there with a little bit of mystery to it. Here's another example, just to give you an idea of how the story goes a little bit longer. We have this lead here of Dennis and John Stevens, and then we get into this baby boomers are retiring in record numbers. So they're the baby boomers, they're the ones who are getting a pet, and then this is what the story is about, this nut graph. It's important to think about focusing your angle on this story. So do some research, figure out what story hasn't been done yet, how you can take a news story and maybe go behind the scenes of it and see what else is there. Plan out exactly how you're going to pick your angle, because really the angle is going to help determine whether or not this is a story people are willing to read all the way through.